I had a sense inside of me that this wasn't okay.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Peter O. Estévez Show. This is your host, Peter O. Estévez. Today we have none other than Faye Jones. Faye Jones is a renowned corporate attorney. She's a TEDx speaker, and she is a best-selling author of her new book, Sex Cult None, to be exact. Hello, Faye Jones, and welcome to the Peter O. Estévez Show. How are you today?
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk with you more about this.
Well, I am too. You know, we have very similar parallels in growing up. You know, coming from dysfunctional backgrounds, from sexual abuse backgrounds, from not very pleasant beginnings. You were actually raised and escaped from the infamous cult Children of God, which was founded by your grandfather back in 1968. I want to start right there because I think it's important where Sex Cult None comes in and where does your TED Talk come in, I Own Me, right? Because certain so dear and cherished to you, something that a child has no idea how valuable it is, and the aspect that happens to us when it's taken away, the right to our own being, the right to our body, the right to who we are as a person can destroy us forever. And many of us have never recovered. In fact, I truly believe that there's different states of where children that are abused go through. You know, first, you know, there's a perpetrator, there's a victim, that in many occasions becomes the perpetrator or a participant. But I think ultimately what we want to be is the survivor and then the advocate, right? So tell us a little bit about your story and how did you get here? How did you get to become who you are today, and you own who you are today?
Well, to really understand that, you will have to read the book because that's why I wrote it. There's such a lot of information. It's like impossible to completely summarize it, but I'm going to give it a shot here. Okay.
Sure.
So my family founded this organization called the Children of God. Now, initially it was founded as it was a religious movement. So fundamentalist Christian movement, very strong ideals. The people who joined were very idealistic. They wanted to save the world. They wanted to, they came out of the hippie generation. They were, anti-war and in this kind of way. So my grandfather had kind of a ready group of people who were looking for something to do with their lives, purpose, mission. And that's how they ended up joining really his family, which is the core of what started it, and growing into hundreds and then thousands and 10,000 members all over the world. But like for me to see this group, and I grew up in it, and I know like we were very, very dedicated to God. We spent hours a day in prayer and in reading the scriptures and in, reading my grandfather's religious writing. Mostly they were called the Mo letters. And, separation, the main tenets were separation from the world. We lived communally. And some things about that were good, right? Some things about that, people all helped each other. If you had a large family, there was always someone there to help you. There was a support structure, right? And then some things were really bad. And this is, for me, I grew up in it and I was in this organization till I was in my early 20s. So I just turned 23 when I left. And, growing up in this, so part of the other things, we believed like the end of days was imminent. My grandfather prophesied, Jesus would return, the tribulation would happen in 1993. And, so I didn't expect to become an adult. And we didn't prepare for that. Nobody owned any property. Nobody, looked at investment or wealth or anything to take care of themselves in old age because Jesus was coming back and we were all going to die, right? And so we were preparing for like Antichrist and soldiers to come and get us. And it was just a very, very different perspective. Education was not focused on just like basic education. for the children. We didn't go to school. We were homeschooled, but like minimally, really. I mean, like 8th grade was about all you were considered you needed, because you were just going to live your life in this group. You were never going to have a job, right? So it was a interesting blend of beliefs. And one of the things that became the most famous for was that my grandfather took a very different stance on sex. So initially it was very conservative, no sex unless you're married. But after some years, my grandfather began a process of kind of slowly indoctrinating people into a new view, which justified things that he personally wanted to do. Like he wanted to take on other women. He wanted to take on another wife. He had his own inclinations, which we can see now from the writings, towards pedophilia, which were even before the group, right? And so he created this thing called the law of love, whereby he was considered God's prophet, God's end time prophet, right? So what he said, his dreams, his revelations were, the word of God, basically. And he created this thing called the law of love, and he used the Bible to back it up. And this is the danger we run into when we can use and manipulate really any kind of scriptures for our own benefit. And so he created a doctrine called the law of love, which said that anything done in love was okay, and that the old 10 commandments, all of that was out the door. And then that went into sexual freedom, which then became, in a way, sexual coercion for many people, especially for women, because he said, well, men need sex the same way that they need food and clothing. And so you need to provide that for them. And then this led to a doctrine, even outside of marriage, right? So you're supposed to do something called sharing, which was having sex with people outside of your marriage. Now, this was done as a duty, actually, a duty to God. So women were supposed to do it even with men they were not attracted to, they didn't want to, and as I grew up and began faced with this, it was really a very difficult and traumatic thing. And, but there was a level of coercion that came into it. So it wasn't just freedom. And the coercion came into it where it was saying that if you were not willing to have sex with some man, so I faced this as a teenager, that I had to have sex with certain men in the organization. And if you were not, then you were unyielded to God. Then you were not following God's will. Then you were, hard-hearted, stubborn, disobedient, rebellious. And then you could be punished and experience breakings, public humiliation, etc., due to the fact that you were not being yielded to God, right?
Let's you unpacked a lot of stuff right there, and I want to. And it's all very interesting, but I want to take you back to a couple of things, because I want to make sure that the audience is able to understand the process that you went through, right? This started as a noble cause, as a religious movement based on the scripture, right? And at some point that turned. At some point, your grandfather became his own God, for lack of a better word, right? He started, because there's nowhere in the scripture that says that there's law of love and that there's sexual freedom. I mean, there's no way in the scripture that says that, right? You're an attorney. You've done a lot of research, not only for your books, but for your TED Talks, even research that you've done for your corporate clients that you represented all over the world. So at what point, or what was the defining point that shifted your grandfather? Have you been able to determine that?
Yes. So for me to identify, this was the question I had for many years after I left, was how did these, very idealistic people who really wanted to do good in the world, right, end up committing and subjecting themselves to these terrible abuses, even so far as child abuse, adult sexual contact with children, et cetera, which he justified in this same way. How did this happen, right? And identified, I think it was in 2018, where I created this framework, right? This foundational framework, which are, I say these are sort of the immutable principles of conduct, of integrity that we have to follow. And that's what they didn't have. So it started with the concept of you don't own yourself. This is how this lie and this deception came in, because they said, well, the Bible says, right, that you're bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body and your spirit, which are God's. That means you don't own yourself. Your body is not your own. Your body belongs to God, so you need to do whatever God says. Well, in any kind of organization or group like this, they're saying, well, yes, but we speak for God. So you have to do what we say, right? And the leader's word is God. And so basically, in effect, the organization owns you. The organization owns your body, the leader does, right? And you have to do whatever they say, including it up to having sex with people, marrying people you don't want. People were separated from their children, right? So you had to give over everything to God, quote unquote, but was that God, right? That was the will of the organization, the will of the leadership. So that was the lie. That people, even that they even can. And see, this is where I stand. I say you cannot give over your property right in your body. Each person, we have our awareness, our soul, or consciousness, whatever you want to call it, has a full property right in their own body. This body is your vehicle to experience this reality. You cannot give it away. So long as your consciousness is attached to your body, it belongs to you. It is your full property. In the Constitution, we say we have an inalienable right. That means it cannot be taken away. We have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what the founders were trying to get at when they wrote that this concept that I'm saying, except that they made, a severe mistake because they didn't extend that to women or people of color or other things like that, right? But they were trying to get to that point. Now we're at a point in society.
And Faith, excuse me to interrupt you. That's all fine and dandy for you to understand as adults, right? We understand that today, especially because now we have a height alert for circumstances like that. But there has to have been a process of grooming for the children to be able. First is religion, okay, and then there's a process of grooming to where most perpetrators end up seducing and grooming their victims into making them believe that it is okay what they're doing, right? So there's a God factor. I represent God, and God says it's okay for you to do this, right? And now you're talking about owning our rights, owning our body in a process. How do we teach that to children, young children? Because as I shared with you in our pre-podcast interview, I'm a victim of sexual abuse. Okay, my father was a pedophile. He abused every single one of my sisters. Okay, 6 of my sisters were sexually abused by my father. I don't share that story because I am because I live in a victim mentality. I share my story because it's a story of many. My story, your story, is what allows others to be able to speak up and say, hey, me too. That happened to me too. So what I want our audience to be able to understand is how do we teach these principles, not only to the adults, but how does a mom and dad go back and teach these principles to the children at home?
That's great. And that's exactly what I want to do. I mean, I want to create like videos and stuff that help teach this to children. And I have taught it to children, even like little 8-year-olds, and they get it right away. When I explain, you have a right in your body. This is your property. This is why, you don't hit somebody because you're touching their property, right? This is why you don't take her truck. And, it gives us language to teach children this. And I find that kids get it right away. When I explain this to a child, it's like, and I think it's because it's inherent in our human, as humans, we have a sense of this, right? So even when I was a small child and I had been groomed, I mean, I had coloring books about sex. It was in all of the images and the cartoons and the books that I read. It was everywhere. And not just in a sense of like, this is healthy. And, and I think that children should be raised without shame towards their bodies or towards sex, but it was so much in your face and you're constantly aware of it. I don't even remember a time I didn't know about sex. I literally don't remember it. Right. So, and then being shown sexual acts as a child and then being asked to engage in them when I was as young as like 6 years old. So that, like you said, that's a grooming process that happens to children. But how do we teach children about this? Even then, in those moments, it was like, even being to everything I was told that this was okay, right? That this was good, that this was godly. I had a sense inside of me that this wasn't okay. There was just like a feeling that I had, like, this is too adult for me. There's something not right here. This is kind of, icky, whatever this is. I had a sense of that. And I think, we don't recognize that children do feel this. They have an inherent sense of this, I believe, even if they are raised to believe it's okay. But giving them the language, the words, the terminology, the concepts to understand so that if something does happen to them, they know how to express it. Very often when children are abused, they don't realize it's abuse. They don't understand it. Someone does something to them and it just confuses them, but they don't know how to express it. So teaching them these concepts of you own your body. If somebody touches you in a way that makes you uncomfortable, then that's not okay, right? Like giving them these principles will give them the language to even speak about it if it happens to them.
Sure, absolutely. Because even though it may be inappropriate touch, there's also the senses of dopamine rushes and other rushes that we experience as human beings. And that spirals into a completely lost of control and wondering, is it right? Is it wrong? But it's wrong, but it feels good, but it's uncomfortable. I mean, I remember experiencing that as a young boy. Something very interesting that you said, when somebody like your grandfather represents and you are thought to believe that he is a representative of God, right? You are thought to believe that he has a direct link, a direct connection to God. I grew up Catholic, and my family, not my father directly, but my mom. My mother would pray for hours on end. Very often, I was very cynical, thinking, what the hell does she pray for? Nothing ever changes here, right? What I realized that it did change. It changed through me because I was able to break the cycle, and other of my siblings were able to break the cycle. So it did change. But the reality is that there's such an amount of manipulation in religion, and it has been going on for many centuries, to be able to control crowds, to be able to control the population, to be able to control this, everything, right?
Yes.
I used to find a direct link that that my biological father, and the father, there was a hierarchy of connection, which is what we are taught in religion, right? To a certain degree, your father is supposed to be the example of what God is. And it was not until I entered the process of recovery. I've been sober from addiction 22 years, and it was not until I entered the process of recovery and that I actually had a sponsor or a mentor, whatever you want to call him. And he and I did the third step prayer. And for the very first time, when we're doing this prayer, which is surrendering your will and your life to the care of God, as you understand him, okay? Not as a supreme force, not as anything special, but as you understand him. It was the very first time that I was able to separate the church from my father. See my father as an imperfect human being, that he was only able to give what he was given, right? And see God for what he is, the supreme force, if you believe in that, right? So it was the first time that I had such a separation between me and my father. I was able to see him as a flawed man and not as my father, and not as a perpetrator either. So it's a very difficult situation for children to be in that position. But I want to ask you a question. Where were your parents in this space? This is your grandfather, the hierarchy, the patriarch of the family, seen early on as a man of God that is leading this movement. He's leading the movement of children of God. Who does not want to belong to that part of the movement, right? They're anti-war. So where were your parents in this? when you were growing up, and where are they today? I think it's equally important.
Well, you spoke to a couple really interesting things there, and we can get into that. One is the concept of you being able to separate and identify your father from God and as a flawed human, right? And for me, that process actually happened very young. I saw my parents as that from a very young age.
Wow, that's very
By 12, I already had separated from them as parents, and I saw them as flawed humans, people even that I needed to take care of sometimes. And that I think helped. And for me, I had a direct relationship with God. And that even
powerful.
When I left,
very powerful faith.
Thank you. Even when I left the group, I could see so many people around me. I could see the actions that they were doing were wrong. And I could see that even all the beliefs that I had been taught, so many of those beliefs were false. I was still able to distinguish that from God and say, okay, all of this is lies. I know I can't trust my parents to be there for me or to protect me or to take care of me. So to me, I could only turn directly to God. God was the only being, that being of love and care that I knew that I could connect to. And that's really very powerfully what helped me get through so many of these traumas, was turning to God in those moments and afterwards. So that to me is a very important part of who I am. But as to like my parents and where they were, I mean, they were true believers in this. There was some things that they did or didn't engage in, but they definitely believed and followed the teachings. And I mean, this is one of the questions: how can you be so deceived, right? I mean, my father was kind of born into it as well. I mean, his father took him out of school at the age of 12, and he was basically just indoctrinated into this his whole life. My mother joined very young. She was very young, impressionable, like hippie dropout, and then they spend all of their adult lives in this organization. And it wasn't until later that things happened, I think, caused them to start to really question. And they left many, many years ago themselves as well. It took them, I think, some time it took me time as well after I left to even identify that this was wrong, that the doctrine was wrong. I think it took them a bit longer, but for me, and as I talk about in the book, I understood that, because how hard would it be to, have devoted your entire adult life to something, leave when you're maybe in your 50s, or almost 60s, and then say, oh my God, like there's a lot of things in this that were wrong. I'd say that's a pretty hard thing to do. So I have to give my parents credit that they have been able to see that, and that they have, been able to apologize to their children and to shift and to change. And to me, the most important thing for people is that, right? Like, it wasn't really even that important to me that my parents apologized to me, because I recognized that I own myself. I'm the only one that is fully responsible for my own happiness. It does not depend on anybody else. Nothing anybody else can do. No apology, no punishment, no nothing. It's up to me. And so recognizing that full responsibility enabled me to take back my power and to go after what I wanted, which was happiness and healing and health and success. And, when they were able to come around to it and acknowledge it, I was happy for them, because that showed that they were open to growth, right? To be able to recognize and see this. And when I created this framework, I shared it with my mother, and her and I were able to get into, it gave her so much more clarity. It gave both of us so much more clarity about the things we had both experienced in the group, and what was abuse and why, and how that manipulation took place. We were able to clearly identify it by looking at these fundamental principles. And
let's
that's
talk
really
about
what this does.
let's talk about the principles, and tell us how walk us briefly to each one of them, and then we'll get back right back. We'll pick up where you left.
So it begins with the concept I already talked about. The first principle is I own myself. I have a full property right in my body. With the thing you need to understand is each principle of ownership also comes with it the freedom and the responsibility. There's always a balance on both sides. If I fully own myself, I'm also fully responsible for my thoughts, actions, emotions. I cannot put that on anyone else. I cannot say in these groups, what happens is people think they can turn over their sense of moral responsibility for their actions by saying, well, I was just doing what I was told. Okay. And I say, no, when you commit a violation of one of these principles, that is on you. Even if you were told to do so, you still bear the moral responsibility for your own actions.
And how do you maintain that core principle when you are susceptible to group peer pressure?
So we're going to talk about that. That's the fourth ring.
Okay.
That's the fourth ring, right? But I think when you have a certainty as to these principles, to where nobody can move you because you have worked them out through logic for yourself, then you become so much less susceptible to all of that stuff. You become less susceptible to manipulation, to peer pressure, to all of it. And that's what gives you the power and the strength. Because so often, if you've been abused, if you've been in domestic violence situation, if you've had experienced child abuse, one of the key things that we struggle with is boundaries, healthy boundaries and healthy relationships. And so this diagram here, it literally gives you the boundaries. It defines them for you. Because if you don't have them inherently, you need someone else to say, this is the standard. This is the bare minimum. You follow this, you'll be okay. Right?
Right.
So that's what this gives. And that's what they did not have in the group. What happened was they didn't have these principles of absolute saying, this is the standard, don't violate these. So they were susceptible to say anything my grandfather came up with and all of his so-called revelations were true, right? And follow them instead of having an objective standard to measure each revelation against and say, hold on, wait, this seems to violate this principle, so it cannot be right. See? So right. The second principle, once I know I own my body, I own my creations. Everything that I create with my body, right? My services, if I paint a painting, if I, my intellectual creations, my physical creations, those are mine too. I fully own them. I don't owe them to anybody else. The next layer, once I create something, is I get to make a deal. I get to exchange it. In the Constitution, we protect this as a right, the right of contract. And so this layer governs all relationships, all business, all personal relationships. Some people don't like it when I say that, but if you are in any kind of a healthy relationship, you are already following these principles, right? And the principles are, I know what the deal is. I know what the offer is, right? I'm not trying to hide the ball on the other person. The other person gets to willingly accept it or reject it. There is an actual exchange of value. Sure. Right. So this is even in a personal relationship, we understand that if one person is doing all the giving and the other person is doing all the taking, right. That's a bad relationship.
Yeah, it's not equitable.
Bad, right. Mm-hmm. So when you think about this, these are the elements of good, healthy relationships. We just don't articulate them specifically. But this is when you see it happen, you know what it is. The fourth level is mental capacity. You have to have the mental ability to understand the impact of the agreement. This is where things like child abuse, sexual abuse occur, right? Because they say, well, the kid seemed to be like the kid was willing. I'm like, well, they can't be, right? They can't be. We do not allow children to enter into contracts because they're not capable of understanding the implication of what that is doing and what that is taking from them and how that's going to affect them in their lives in the future, right? So just the same as we don't allow, someone has dementia, we don't allow them to enter into a contract to give away their property. So that's that level. And the fifth level, the fifth element is no undue pressure. And this is where, the vast majority of this stuff happens. The level of no undue pressure. A violation of that would be blackmail in a contract, right? If I'm applying pressure to get you to do something you don't want to do, and it's not where it's like, here's the offer, do you like it? Do you want to have this free exchange? Applying negative pressure, this is blackmail. In relationships, we call it emotional blackmail. right? So, and how does this happen with children? And this is where I talk about, and I talk about it in my Psychology Today article, more specifically. This is another element of what happens when we're talking about sexual abuse of children, and is because when you're in a situation where there is a power disparity, there is always the opportunity for abuse. And anytime there is a power disparity in the sense of an adult and a child, that will always cause a violation. That will cause abuse. That will cause trauma later, because what you're talking about is a child is biologically programmed to want to please the adults. It's biologically programmed for their own survival. Right?
Sure.
They have to love their parents, even if their parents are abusive. They have to want to please, right? So is that they cannot really make a free choice, as we consider a free adult grown-up decision about that, right? And so it's just inherent in the act, you see? And when I recognize this, and I recognize both of those levels, then it helped me to get rid of any kind of lingering sort of feeling of being responsible for the abuse that I had suffered, because I was able to recognize it didn't matter if I seemed to agree to it. Of course I was going to. Sure. I mean, it's like the level is like you get spanked and punished on the one hand if you're not pleasing them. Of course you want to please them, right? You know, you love them. And so, you know, that those combined make it impossible for children to make a free decision in that kind of environment. And that really helped me to, like I said, release any kind of lingering sense of, you know, responsibility, and to clearly see this is how this violation takes place.
You know, it's very interesting, something that you said. I find those principles incredible, very, very, very incredible. And they're going to be available. There's going to be a link to on our show notes for people to be able to look through them. I also encourage you to listen to Faith's TEDx talk, which is she goes very in detail about this over and over. But Faith, I want to ask you a couple of questions. You said that there was it took me 38 years to realize the severity of the dysfunction that I grew up in, right? The social conditioning that I have been impacted to. And although I didn't manifest the same forms of behaviors, there was very similar actions and behaviors that I manifested. Okay. You know, dysfunction is dysfunction. It doesn't matter how you code it, right? You know, like, for example, I'm not a pedophile, but I had, I confused sex with love and love with sex, you know, and there was also this continuous need for being involved in a relationship. So I went through multiple relationships, one after the other, and an incredible need for validation. Okay, it has taken me many years of therapy, many years of personal development work, and a lot of work on myself to be able to break through and be able to have that separation, as seeing my parents as human beings, as people that were fallible and flawed like I am. But you said something that really caught my attention. You said you were able to have that separation very early on. Okay. What gave you that sense of separation? When did you see it? Was it part of the fact that you went in there believing in God, and this was a religion, quote unquote, based environment? Or what was it that gave you that clarity and the separation between the fact that your parents were flawed and not even have a sense of resentment against them early on?
You know, it was actually something that we were taught. And I think maybe I took it in a different way than other people did. I don't know. Right. I think I incorporated it more into who I was. But it was, you know, we were taught, like, look, you know, your choice and your decision to be to serve God and to do all this stuff. It doesn't matter what your parents did. You're responsible. This is your choice now, right? And of course, they didn't really mean that, but I took it. Yeah,
because it was part of the grooming. Yeah,
it was. I understood that it was a truth, actually,
right.
Even beyond what they were trying to use it for.
Right.
And
right.
So it became part of my core of who I was to understand that. And things happen, you know, if, like, for instance, I had early experience of abandonment, and there's other types of stuff that can cause you to grow up very fast. I had to grow up very fast. Not only was I subjected to sexual stuff, but I was subjected to high levels of responsibility. Like I talk about in my book, you know, when my baby brother was born, I was 11. I took almost full responsibility for his care. Like this was normal, that you were supposed to, you were preparing yourself to be like an adult by the time you were 12. And now that kept shifting as everything kept shifting in the group. And that's one of the things about these kind of cults. You keep people off balance by constantly shifting rules and you know, stuff like that. But I really internalized that. I had to grow up and I had to care for others at a young age. And so I would say that, I mean, those are some of the things that happened that other people would look at and say, well, that's terrible. And I was like, yeah, well, it did help me to have that sense of responsibility for myself. And, you know, and then I was also forced into situations where I had to become, so I talk about in the book, that there came a time when my parents were actually forcibly separated by the group and we were sent away. My mother and myself and the two young children were sent away, and sort of the abuses I experienced in Thailand in a commune there. And we ended up in the US for about a year, and, you know, just going through that process. My mother couldn't support us. I had to really become the other adult in the family. And I was out like on the streets and parking lots with Ken, you know, trying to raise money to feed my family. Right.
Wow.
So, you know, that had a very strong impact on me. And I had to be her emotional support as well. See, so I knew that I was, in a way, the adult. I had to grow up really, really fast. And that helped me to separate that sense of, you know, them as parents and them just as human beings. And another thing that I did, which I think, the thing is, like growing up, I didn't realize this was abuse. So it wasn't until some years after I left, and I was dating a lawyer at the time. And, you know, I never spoke about this to anybody. Nobody knew I'd been in the family. When I left, it was just like, I didn't speak about it. I didn't talk about the cult. My family was just, you know, they were missionaries, non-denominational, you know, on a farm in Macau.
Right, you created your own story, right?
I didn't lie, but I didn't give very many details. Right. You know, I just kind of glossed it over. I didn't want people to see me as that, like a cult kid, and be like, oh my God, and I wanted them to see this person that I was creating of who I wanted to be. And so finally, one of my boyfriends, I talk about it, he was like military person. He dragged the stories out of me. And, you know, and then he was able to show me, he was like, look, you know, if you are coerced into having sex for fear of punishment, that's rape. Like in the law, we call that rape. Okay. And it just kind of, I just created a whole different perspective on what had happened to me and what happened to me in my life. So I also detail some of like my journey of these realizations, because in the book, it's in the moment. So you are hearing me like starting at 4 years old, what I was thinking. It's written like a novel, right? So it's in the moment. It's not me looking back, right? Right. So I want you to have that experience of what it was like to think and feel and how we perceived the world, and then how these realizations hit me after I left, and how they, you know, eventually reached this point where I have this framework that can clearly articulate these principles. And this is why I want to get this out, right? Because for me, it took years to come to understand this stuff. Whereas I've simplified it now into a way that people can, you know, get it in a few minutes, I hope, or an hour, right? They'd be able to grasp this stuff for themselves. Yeah, so that was it's been quite a journey on that one.
Faith, there was you know, you left the cult at 23 years old, right? What was the straw that broke the camel's back? What was it? What was that deciding factor? You said, this is it, I had enough. And what was it like to start all over, you know, and out there on your own? So tell us a little bit about that. What was your process to make that decision, and what was it to start all over?
So there had been certain things in my life where I had been exposed to the outside world. You know, I actually had studied Mandarin at a university in China, and because we were pretending to be normal people, we got to kind of live like normal people. Wow. Yeah. You know, and experience a bit more freedoms. And for me, it was a desire to go to college. It was a desire to go get an education. So we were not allowed, we didn't go to school outside. We were basically given a grade school education. After my mother's experience, where we were briefly outside the family in the US when I was 12 and we couldn't support ourselves, we were brought back in. My father came and got us and brought us back in. But after that point, I think for both of us, there was a strong sense of uncertainty about like the family and, you know, our role and what could happen to us there. And so I really wanted to do I wanted to finish high school. And that was kind of frowned upon. That was not allowed. But my mother helped me get a correspondence course. So I actually taught myself high school, just sitting down at my desk every day, reading the books and taking the exams for this like Christian correspondence course that she managed to get for me. And when I left, and there was this seed planted in me of a desire to learn, a desire to expand my horizons. I'm always so curious. I love to learn. And in the group, it was so restricted. I was just going crazy with boredom because we were only allowed to read the religious literature. And it was just kind of the same stuff rehashed over and over and over again.
Right.
And I didn't see there was no ambition. You weren't going to have a career. You were just going to get married and have babies and preach the gospel and wash dishes for the rest of your life, basically. Right. And I was like, the depression is when the future that you see is not something you want and you see no other way out.
Uh-huh.
And that's when I hit depression. I didn't even know what it was because we didn't believe in depression in the family, right? Or therapy or anything else. So, but I would like every day for months, I would just wanted to cry all day, every day. And I was like, this is not normal. I'm not sure what this is, but this is not normal for me, right? And that's what really pushed me to say, I can't do this anymore. I can't deal with the constant supervision. I can't even go to a 7-Eleven by myself. I have to have a buddy. Like everything in my life is controlled and stipulated, and I can't go out and read books and study or anything like that. And so that's when I made the decision to leave, because I really wanted to get an education. And of course, when you leave the group, you have no money. They don't give you any money. They're not like there to help you, right?
Right.
So I got a job teaching English for a summer to actually raise the money.
You were in China. You were in China at this point.
I was in China at this point, and then I went to Macau, and an old friend of the family had a club, so I went and taught the employees English for the summer to raise enough money so I could buy a ticket to fly back to America. Okay. I knew I wanted to try to study in America, so I came back to America, and then I approached different colleges, and they said, "Well, you don't have an academic record that we recognize." Right. So go to community college and get a transcript so we can see how you compare to other people. So I did that. I went to community college, and I had to catch up on like some basic classes and stuff that I just, I hadn't gotten. And I got my transcript, and then I managed to transfer into Georgetown University. And then in Georgetown, I, really applied myself. And one of the things I used to like to say is that they didn't give us much education, but they taught us how to work really, really hard. And I could focus. And, to me, this was all me. I got a scholarship, and but that was, it was a merit-based scholarship. So I had to keep good grades, and I worked as well. I worked all my way through college as well, just to have money, for food. So is there any retributions once you leave the cult? Was there anything, did they come after you? Was there any threats? No, it wasn't that type of a cult. It wasn't that kind of a thing. It was the power lay in the manipulation of the mind, right? The power lay in keeping people in economically as well, by saying, if you leave, you're out of God's will, God's going to punish you, you're going to end up in jail, on drugs, stripping, and a lot of kids did. Because they left and they didn't have an education, and they felt so traumatized and they didn't know what to do. So I wanted to say, no, you don't have to take that path. There's also a lot of kids that did really well, that did something similar. They went back to school and they did well. So, I wanted to show people that there is a path for you. Even if you ended up without education, there's so much resources that you can access that you can go and do that if that's really what you want.
Well, absolutely. And you've shown it yourself. I mean, you went from not having any kind of educational record to going to the community college, to creating a transcript, to go to Georgetown University, to become a successful corporate attorney, an author, a TED speaker. I mean, it's commendable. The slew of accomplishments you have been able to hang on to, and I congratulate you for that. Something that is very common in children that come from dysfunctional backgrounds, from dysfunctional environments, we become very susceptible to addiction, to dysfunction, to repeating the cycles. How were you able to fan all of that? What was it? What principal value did you adopt yourself to, or held on to that prevented you from becoming another statistic?
It's a good question. I think I was committed to succeed. I was committed to succeed, and I wanted to be happy. And, that to me, and that meant I had to also go after healing in a big way. For a long time, I just kind of put blinders on, didn't think about anything else. I just focused on like my education and success and just pushing through and surviving, But when I got to a certain level of success, I recognized that a lot of my survival or coping mechanisms and techniques had now become hindrances, right? They're hindrances to relationships and to other things. And like you said, recognizing that addiction of any type. I mean, I had a very strong kind of internal sense of like not wanting to be addicted to substances, right? I hated the idea of having a crutch, right? Like to be dependent on something. And I think it was just this fierce independence and need because of not being able to rely on people in my life and stuff, right? I knew I had to protect myself, and I'd been through a lot of bad stuff. So I had this sense that I had to do that. But I would still use substances like romance novels or TV or other things like that to kind of numb myself to my emotions when they would just be overwhelming, and the hurt or anger or other things like that. So it took me some time to find, and I tried all kinds of stuff. I mean, I did all the Tony Robbins stuff and the Bob Proctor. I did all these different guys, right? I tried traditional therapy for a while, and it was, talk therapy. It was okay, but it wasn't really moving the needle for me. So, but I stuck with it, and I kept trying different things until I finally found like people and practices and stuff that actually worked for me. And this is a really big part of it. Understanding the framework and getting clarity is huge to healing. Seeing this is an accurate standard that you can start to measure your relationships and yourself by. That is huge for healing. But also doing some of the deep healing work. So I actually, before I wrote my memoir, I actually wrote this book. It's called I Own Me. And it's for women. I mean, specifically, I wrote it to women because I'm a woman, but men who have experienced abuse, a lot of my male friends have, and they've read it, and, they find it helpful as well. And I talk about all these different levels of abuse: child abuse, manipulation, sexual harassment, rape, etc. How do we shift how we think about these things, our self-talk about these things, the excuses, and some of the most powerful healing exercises that I've done for myself that I found have really shifted things for me. So there's one exercise I put in here that a brilliant therapist and coach that I worked with created. And I put it in this book because to me, that was one of the things that you can do for yourself. I mean, you could do it with a therapist if you're really worried about going back into some of those more traumatic events on your own, but you can absolutely do it for yourself. And I do it for myself all the time. Well, not all the time, but once you've worked through some of this stuff, it creates a shift. And this is what I want to tell people, like healing is a shift. It actually shifts your behavior. So that core wound that you're trying to cover up by the addiction, right? That is just a coping mechanism to deal with that pain from that core wound. You have to heal that core wound. All the other stuff you do to try to stop the addiction and this and that is not really going to help, because you may just switch addictions. until you heal that core wound. And so if people don't realize there's a way to actually go in and heal that you really can do that, then I think they lose hope and they just figure, I'm just going to use a coping mechanism. But there are things that can actually go in and heal that. You can really reprocess that trauma and come to that place of more centeredness and peace inside yourself when you do that.
There's a couple of things that you mentioned, and I think it's important for me to elaborate a little bit more on them. And you talked about the fact that your shortcomings, your survival skills, I call them shortcomings, character defects, survival skills. At some point, they turn against you, right? I mean, I saw that because I repeated the same patterns of behaviors, and maybe very early on in life helped me get out of a situation that was uncomfortable. But at some point as an adult in a relationship, I could not use the same coping mechanisms to communicate or to do a business transaction, to raise children, because what I was doing is using the same cycles of behavior that I had grown up, that I had adopted from generational, from social conditioning and from generational that I see. Yeah. Right. So at some points, what got you here won't get you there. And every phase of our lives requires a different us. And that is when the real work comes in. I also think it's very important what you said about the fact that for a long time, what you did, you just needed to survive. You just needed to move on. And that's really what we need to do. We need to escape our current situation. Okay. And then once we are far from that situation and we feel a certain amount of safety, it's okay to start working on ourselves, because I did the same thing. I realized that there was a common denominator in the circumstances that I was in. I was in a poor, dysfunctional, broken environment. So I needed my first solution to that was get out of that environment, make a lot of money. If I make a lot of money, then I'll be okay. Well, then I made a lot of money, but I was applying the same values and the same principles that I grew up in. I needed to peel that onion, remove all those values, remove all that dysfunctional behavior out of my life, even though it manifested in a different way, and start a journey of transformation of the soul, mind, body, and spirit. Okay, not just of the soul, not just of the finances, not just of the body, but everything about me had to change in order for me to be able to get to a point where I loved myself, where there was no longer a empty hole at the center of my soul. And I see that you've done that work. Faith, I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, to join our audience. Your two incredible books, I Own Me and The Sex Cult Nun. I truly encourage our listenership to go out there and buy your books and listen to your TEDx talk, which is incredible. I listened today during my run this morning. What would be some words of encouragement to close up the episode?
I think it's what I said before, is that you can heal. These patterns and things that may be hurting you in your life that you see yourself doing over and over again, you can shift, you can change them. It is possible. I like to say you don't have to stay trapped in the dungeon of pain by the should monster who says you should be broken, you should be upset, you should be, angry. You don't have to let them trap you. If you're ready to move on with your life, there are great healing resources, techniques, tools that you can use. If you want to embrace that and really go for your own joy and happiness, regardless of whatever anybody did to you in the past, that is possible for you. So that's where I'd start.
Faith Jones, successful corporate attorney, author, TEDx speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.